Welcome to Trends with Benefits, an award-winning podcast by Van Eck with a forward-looking perspective. We explore new ways of thinking about the markets, work, and life. Here's your host, Ed Lopez.
Back in 2015, we actually looked at trying to launch a Saudi Arabia ETF.
I heard about it. I wasn't here back then, but I heard that this was a consideration. But I can imagine in 2015, it may have been more difficult to do that with still some relative restrictions on access to the market by foreigners.
Yeah.
But now the picture is very different. So it might be worth another look at the moment.
So it was really interesting to read your blog that you put out in December about going to Saudi Arabia for a number of reasons. One, just for the investment applications of it or implications of it. But two, you as a woman traveling in Saudi Arabia is just really interesting to think about as well, perhaps given the perceptions that I have and maybe other people have about Saudi Arabia. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast, Ola. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I'm also very excited to talk about this because I was also very impressed by the changes and the ease of actually traveling there right now as a woman, like you mentioned. So looking forward to this conversation.
So I'm speaking with Ola El-Shawarby, Senior Analyst for Van Eck's Emerging Market Strategies. And, she recently put out a really interesting blog about traveling to Saudi Arabia. And you can find that on the vaneck.com website. And I wanted to speak to her as I was just teeing up that we had, as a firm, had looked at launching a strategy, an equity strategy in Saudi Arabia, and the market was opening up and a lot of hurdles to get through as well. But as I mentioned, I think her trip as a woman traveling in Saudi Arabia really piqued my interest, and I'd love to get her take on that as well. So, Ola, maybe I'll just ask you, what was the reason for the trip? What was the impetus to plan this trip out there?
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Like you mentioned, I've actually been going to Saudi Arabia for many, many years. Initially, when I was much younger, for personal reasons, and then over the past decade or so, for professional reasons, basically to find investment opportunities. So that was a research trip to basically scout the market opportunities and see if there is something that we can look at for the Emerging Markets Fund at Van Eck. And I was quite blown away by the amount of change that I saw on the ground. And this was even relative to right before COVID. My last trip before COVID actually was also Saudi Arabia in very early 2020. So I got to see some of those changes evolve back then, but this time it was so visible. So there's a lot going on that we are going to talk about. And definitely with changes and reform comes more appetite for investments. And that's my job, really, to find those investment opportunities and see where we can position the fund for future growth.
So your role is covering the Gulf Coast countries, is that right? Or give me a sense of your scope.
Sure. So actually, I'm one of the senior research analysts on the emerging market equities team. And my specific focus is predominantly on the Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. So it's a fairly broad region that included Russia up until last year. And it includes MENA, it includes Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. So that's my area of coverage and focus. So obviously the GCC falls within that. But I would say one thing that maybe some people don't really realize as much is that the weight of the region is growing quite significantly. So I think now it's approaching close to 9%. And that obviously got somewhat helped by the exclusion of Russia last year. So the relative weight of the MENA region grew significantly. But also the region has been seeing so much growth in terms of initial public offerings and new companies coming to the market, which also helped the weight grow. And within that 8 or 9% weighting, Saudi is by far the largest, most liquid and heaviest weight within the region. So with that, obviously, and a lot of reform that happened, not just on the social and economic front, but also just within the capital market itself and the ability for foreigners to access the public equities market over the last few years, it becomes much more of an interesting investment, an investable place than it was maybe a decade or so ago.
Yeah. And so you've been before, and you mentioned that Did
Yeah,
did
many times.
yeah. So all right. So when we were looking at an idea for an ETF there, we even considered sending one of our product managers at the time, and she was a female, and there was some concern there as well. Is that a misperception about women traveling in Saudi Arabia, or has something changed meaningfully there on that social front?
I think I wouldn't say there were misperceptions at the time because, it was very difficult. I mean, it was difficult to get a visa even for business for Saudi Arabia, generally speaking. But for women, it was close to impossible because there were so many rules around needing to have a male companion travel with you, and that male companion had to be a relative, so like a father, a brother, a husband. So obviously that when you're traveling for work, it's not like you take, your family members along with you. So that made it very difficult for investors generally and for female investors in particular to access the market physically, like go there and do their usual due diligence. I mentioned I did go to Saudi many times, even growing up as a child. But the reason why this was possible because my father, who's a doctor, a physician, and a university professor, was teaching in different Saudi universities for many, many years as I was growing up. So with my family, I used to spend a lot of time there. I'm Egyptian by background, so I'm from Cairo, but because of that connection to Saudi, I did spend a very significant part of my younger years there. And then when I joined my previous role at an emerging markets fund, and Saudi became relatively accessible as a market through P notes initially, and then for qualified financial investors. And I was their MENA analyst. The only reason I was able to still go was because my dad wasn't retired at the time. And every time I applied for a visa, it was a family visit visa. But then I would go there and, do also meetings in addition to meeting up with my dad. So that's obviously a very specific circumstance that helped me and helped my previous employer have, somewhat of an advantage in the market. But this is not a way to like scale investments. And also, I mean, just going there, it was difficult to set up meetings. Sometimes I remember going to visit a cement company that was listed, and their offices were right at the plant. And I was literally the only female, not just in the office, but probably on the block and in the industrial area. So obviously everyone was looking at me in a weird way. I go into the elevator, everyone else walks out because they're not sure like what's the right way to behave. So it was definitely, not very comfortable. I knew it enough to be okay and like sort of, behave appropriately and not really try to make anyone very uncomfortable. But it wouldn't be the case for someone who had never been there or is only going there for professional reasons. And obviously there were also restrictions around how you can dress as a woman. So you had to wear the abaya, which is like the big black gown that women there traditionally wear, and for the most part at least cover your hair. That has changed so much on this visit. And I guess it was interesting because when I went there last year, I went with a small group of investors, many of them foreigners, who were now able to go for the first time after the reforms. And people who hadn't been there before still go and look at, how some of the local population, local women are dressed, and they still think it's quite conservative. But for someone like me who has, who knows where the place, historically was coming from, was blown away because first of all, I was going around in a business suit during my visit, which never happened before. No cover necessary, like no hair, no abaya. So that was a first after 30 something years of going there.
Were you nervous at all doing that at first, or?
I was a bit, because my first day when we were going to see some of the policymakers and some of the government institutions like the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, I actually in my head thought, you know what? No, I don't really fully believe this, so I'm going to wear the abaya just in case. But I had stopped covering my hair even like from the last 2 or so visits. I went there, but then, I looked around me on the streets and like with other women who were part of the same group, and they were just dressed in like normal business attire. And so the next day I braved it and I went out in a business suit, and for the following 3-4 days as well. And it was perfectly fine. So things like that to me were such a change from the time when I was growing up there. So definitely what strikes you the most, if particularly the place is the social reform and the visible social change. Most obvious with things related to women empowerment, whether it's like the reform of the dress code, whether it's removing the historical ban on women driving. So now you see a lot of women driving their cars and going to work or going out with their friends. Even like at this time, I was also fascinated to see a female Uber driver. So I was kind of mentally prepared to see more women driving, but I wasn't prepared to see a woman Uber driver coming to pick someone up from the hotel next to me.
A woman driver that has a job. That's good.
I know, has a job driving a car, and her job is driving. So it's amazing, really, to see.
The reforms have been happening for quite a few years now. When did it really start kicking off? Was it 2016, around there? Or?
I think the very early signs of reform came in 2016 with the launch of Vision 2030, spearheaded by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as people call him. And I mean, obviously, news headlines in the media about Saudi, about the Crown Prince, are very various in nature. So I'm not going to go into that as much. But in terms of what's happening on the ground, I mean, he's a much younger person than the previous leadership that Saudi ever had, someone in his 30s. And Saudi as a population is a very young population, one of the youngest in the region and quite frankly in the world. So I think 70% of the population is below the age of 34. I think about 60% or so is below the age of 30. So you can imagine that opening up socially is something that would be by and large supported by the majority of people, at least the younger part of the population, which is the majority. And so I think with that change in leadership, there was new thinking. And the vision also started not just triggered by social reform, but I think that came somewhat as a consequence to that. But if you recall, in 2015, we saw the big decline in oil prices, and Saudi, which is an economy that was very heavily and still is to a large extent dependent on hydrocarbons and oil price, saw a very significant decline in their budget and fiscal situation. So they had to make some difficult decisions in terms of fiscal consolidation, cutting some of the subsidies that were there before. And that changed to an extent the social contract, in the sense that before you had all this wealth and you didn't really give people a lot of social freedoms, but they were very comfortable and the government took care of its people and financially and gave them a lot of services for free and a lot of subsidies. But then when that happened, the situation changed and they had to do all these like more difficult measures for several years. And so Vision 2030 came about as a way to diversify the country's economy away from oil. And in a way, it also signaled a change in the social contract. In every meeting that I had this time in Saudi, there were some women present, and you walk around the offices and corporate headquarters, you see so many women at their desks doing their job. And that's not a side that people would have seen in the past. It is very different, and you can see the sentiment shift in a positive way. But obviously, the vision also has very ambitious growth and investment plans. And you hear about these giga projects. The most famous of them in terms of news coverage is Neom, which is a city, give or take the size of Belgium, that they've announced they want to build in the desert close to the Red Sea. And you see all these like images about it being a high-tech, futuristic type of city. Now, obviously, it sounds super ambitious. How much of that actually gets delivered? What are the details like? I don't know, and I'm not sure how much is actually out there.
They've got ambitious plans all across the board, haven't they?
Yeah.
Building out cities like that, investments across the world. NEOM, that's what, NEOM, is that an acronym?
NEOM.
Yeah. Is that the one that's like a big block or something that looks like a big futuristic spaceship in the middle?
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay.
That's there are a lot of like images in terms of like how people imagine it would look like.
Yeah.
But I don't think a lot of the detailed plans, at least, are publicly available. Maybe they are there, but no one really knows exactly. And you hear like big numbers thrown out, like $500 billion of investment cost. Now, what the reality is, I don't know. But all I would like to say is that when I went there during my visit, compared to when first Vision 2030 came out in 2016, at the time, no one really gave it any credit. Everyone thought this is just like, a McKinsey project that was delivered and nothing comes out of it. Right now, in terms of at least some of the evidence that there is progress on the ground, whether it's with some of the other projects like the Red Sea or Amala, which are luxury tourist projects that are being established by the Red Sea, and some of the contracts actually have been awarded, or whether it's on the social reform, there is more evidence that there is progress and that some execution is happening. How far we get, I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of execution risk embedded in there, but the social reform is very tangible. You see it, and it has immediate consequences on consumer confidence, purchasing power. And one thing with that social reform that is also relevant from an investment standpoint, as you open up and loosen up socially, that also opens up a whole set of investments in the entertainment industry. Because up until I can't remember if it was 2018 or before that, movie theaters even were not allowed in Saudi. So growing up there, the only form of entertainment would have been to go to a mall, walk around the shops, maybe eat something. But even the restaurants, you had to go as a family or as a female, you had to go sit in an enclosed area that was like female and family only as a section, and then there was a separate section for the males, and it was always like enclosed with curtains, and I mean not really like a fun experience. But now with all these relaxations, you're seeing movie theaters pop up everywhere, music festivals start happening. You have a lot of the global fine dining establishments that we see here in New York, like Cipriani, very quickly opening up locations. And there are wait lists to get into any of these nice restaurants because people are just so hungry for this type of entertainment and optionality. And that is a business opportunity. It might not yet be as easy to get exposure to that through publicly listed companies. But on the private side, some businesses are now really going heavily into that, and it became a real possibility. So, and it was fun. I mean, I actually had a good time in Riyadh, and it's not something I could have said with confidence in the past. So,
That's amazing. That's great to hear, and to see that you've experienced. You talked about some of the industries. So, entertainment and tourism, from an investment standpoint, do you think that's probably the highest probability bet, I guess, if you will, for lack of a better term, for investors to consider in that space? Or maybe I should ask the question a different way in terms of other industries that you think could really benefit from these reforms, either private companies that will eventually become public companies. Where would you go shopping, so to speak?
yeah, good question. I think, I mean, you mentioned like the tourism and entertainment just from a novelty standpoint, because this was really not a sector that was at all available before, and now it's there, and there's a lot of attention given to it, particularly the luxury resorts by the Red Sea. I think that should do well because I mentioned I'm Egyptian, and we take so much pride in like the Red Sea and how much it offers in terms of like snorkeling and diving and marine life, and it's really amazing. And Saudi's right on the other side of the Red Sea, but think that Egypt has been using its resources for the past 40, 50 years, whereas these are really virgin territories in Saudi. And so for anyone who likes that type of option, it's going to be incredible to go and see some of these untouched marine life areas. Alcohol is not allowed yet. It's maybe something that's a bit harder to push through given Saudi's positioning as the custodian of the two holy sites for Muslims, and just traditionally something that's a bit more frowned upon. But there are some discussions around that. And if that happens, maybe even on like a special zone type arrangement initially, that would obviously appeal even more to some of the foreign tourists. And then obviously there's the religious tourism, which has always been there, but they've been investing even more into expanding the areas and renovating the areas around the two holy sites. So the numbers there are increasing. And they've eased so much the visa process there. So, eliminating all this like stuff about females not being able to travel on their own. So that's not a concern anymore. But other parts of the Vision 2030 emphasize sectors like renewable energy. So remember, the spirit behind it is to diversify the economy away from hydrocarbons. It's not an abandonment because that's not a realistic option. But there's a lot of investment going on into carbon capturing and things like that. So they will continue to be a big producer of oil and natural gas. They also have a goal to reach 50% of their power generation by 2030 coming from renewable energy sources. And there is a very significant pipeline of investments there. Even industries like healthcare, education, particularly on the private side, and insurance, you're seeing a lot of structural reform there to start shifting a lot of the burden to the private sector, because historically the government was really providing all these services for free. So the large majority of Saudi nationals still don't have private insurance because they can just go to the government facilities and get free healthcare. But like we see in other emerging markets, as the population grows and it starts aging, the burden on the public facilities becomes very high. And now, instead of like before trying to just build more public hospitals, they're actually gradually reforming the private health insurance space, giving more people private insurance and then allowing them to go to private healthcare facilities. Similar thing happening with the education, where they're trying to grow and promote the growth of the private education sector so more people can be able to go there and get a better quality education, which wasn't the case in the past for Saudi nationals. So there are many sectors that they're looking at, and it's probably worth mentioning here the role of the Public Investment Fund, or the PIF, as it's globally known, which is Saudi's sovereign wealth fund that had been around for a long time, but really almost got restructured and relaunched in 2016. And now the PIF is really playing a critical role in, facilitating investments in many of these verticals or sectors. So they have a little over $600 billion of assets under management. Part of that is being invested outside Saudi, again, as a way to expand and diversify investments away from the oil economy. But they also have a mandate to invest, I think, about $40 billion domestically every year until 2025. And so they've been investing in what they refer to as national champions in different sectors, like the banking sector, like the renewable energy and power generation sector. Like these giga projects, most of them are actually owned by PIF. And so they're going in, setting the tone, launching these projects. The idea is that they want to, according to them, crowd in private investors, not crowd out. So they think that they go in, kickstart the projects, de-risk the earlier stage of the projects, and then invite people to partner up with them in a way or invest alongside them. And that happens on the private equity type investment side. But also we've seen them coming to the market and publicly listing so many of these assets that they've developed, like the Saudi National Bank, which is the largest bank in Saudi, like Aqua, which is the company that's doing most of the renewable energy pipeline. So they are playing a critical role. Now, whether over time, there's evidence that they are allowing the private sector to invest alongside them. Hopefully that continues to happen, and it doesn't end up in a situation where it becomes a crowding out situation. So that's a risk. But so far, it's not how things are looking. So a lot going on for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like the term crowding in terms of getting it kickstarted and attracting investment. Are they allowing foreign investment?
They are, for sure. They're allowing foreign investment in both the public market. So, compared to the past, and when we as Van Eck had considered this idea of an ETF in the Saudi market, they've eased a lot the restrictions for foreigners to come in. So before 2015, it was through P notes. Then they launched the QFI, the Qualified Financial Investor Scheme, but that was very complicated and it took forever to set up. Now it's very different. Now it's much, much easier for foreign qualified financial investors to get in. So we're seeing this kind of healthy competition, listing more government affiliated assets into the stock market to increase transparency, which is something that has been happening in a very significant way in both the UAE and Saudi over the last year or two. So that healthy competition is actually driving change at a faster pace in the region than I've seen before. And, as someone from the region, I'm both impressed because I didn't really think that things would move this fast. And also quite happy because it really drives or puts the region on people's radar screen in a different way from some of the news headlines that, typically were coming out of the region in the past. So that's quite positive overall, I think.
As far as the public markets in Saudi Arabia, what comprises the biggest part of it? Is it still energy companies? And do you see that changing?
I think it's banks, energy, and petrochemicals probably are the largest sectors. So you do have a pretty heavy weighting in banks through two of the largest banks in Saudi, Al Rajhi being the largest Islamic bank globally and one of the two largest in Saudi, and then the one we mentioned as a national champion, Saudi National Bank. But obviously, Aramco, even with only 5% stake listed in the market, is very sizable. And then you have a lot of petrochemical companies that have been listed also from years ago, just because that is, a ripe market for it, given the availability and price of the feedstock. So these are historically the largest sectors. You have consumer companies there as well, but it's interesting because, I mean, this time around, a lot of the publicly listed consumer companies, which were in more traditional sectors like retail, they haven't really seen the earnings momentum that we would have expected given all the changes in Saudi. But the explanation to that, in many ways, is that people are actually increasingly spending a bigger share of their wallet on these new entertainment options. So they're no longer spending most of their money on like the Zara franchise, buying things that they don't necessarily need just because it's fun and it's a way to pass time. And they're really going instead to a nice restaurant. So we don't have as much access to the newer consumer affiliated sectors through the public markets, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen because the pace of IPOs in Saudi has been incredible. I mean, really, even though I'm someone who's covered the market for over 10 years and has been going there, I think this visit, probably 50% or more of my meetings were with companies I had never met in the past because they were listed over the last year or two. And that's, even in and of itself, just creates a momentum because you're excited to meet new companies as opposed to meeting the usual suspects. So as an investor, as an analyst, that makes me, happier, more excited to go there. I think it will happen with time. It's just a matter of when, not if, really.
How do you think through geopolitical issues, concerns, headlines about the relationship of the U.S. and Saudi and other democracies to Saudi Arabia when thinking about, should I make an investment there as a U.S. investor?
I mean, it's obviously a very controversial and almost like a very tricky one to answer for me as someone from the region who's probably more used to political turbulence than others who didn't grow up in the Middle East. It's definitely a risk. It stops some serious investors from taking the step of investing in the country and in the region overall. But as an emerging markets investor, I wouldn't say it's unique to Saudi or the region. I mean, you see political risk in Brazil, in Mexico, and it doesn't take the same shape or form, or it's maybe not as difficult to stomach as some of the headlines that we've seen here. And I'm very mindful of that, and definitely not coming here to promote that or defend that in any way. But I'm just saying, as an emerging markets investor, a lot of times you start separating a little bit, your perception as a person to some of these issues with what's going on the ground and where some of the interesting investment opportunities lie. And you become also aware that in some situations where there are bad things that are happening, there are also good things that are happening that are helping people, that are necessary for human development. So you kind of balance out the risk reward on both the financial side and also just on the practical side, like just from a human impact standpoint. All the social reforms that we talked about, the women empowerment, that's great. And that's something that I'm definitely supportive of, even if it happens as, alongside other things that I don't necessarily, like. But yeah, you kind of think about the risk, but as an EM investor, as someone who invests in these markets, you try and think about different ways you can get involved without really getting involved.
Yeah, and I guess at the very least, as you pointed out, as it grows and becomes a bigger part of EM indices, you're just going to have to pay attention to
At
it
least
anyway.
look at it.
Yeah.
You may or may not pull the trigger in terms of like investing and getting more actively involved, but I think it's an area that you have to look at, pay attention to, how much you're willing to get involved and take risk there. I do respect that it's not for everyone, for sure.
I wonder if I could ask you just to change countries briefly, and I think this one could be a whole nother podcast in of itself, but just curious what your thoughts are on Egypt today. I know there's been some turbulence there recently, but
Yeah.
generally as an investment destination, what are you looking at, or what are you thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously also Egyptian, so it's a country that's very close to my heart on a personal level, not just professionally. Long term, I think Egypt has a lot going for it. I mean, a very young population, a very sizable market, a lot of areas for development, and the younger generation is different from the past, that you're seeing a lot of entrepreneurial drive and people coming up with ideas and not really waiting around and trying to find just a regular job or support from the government. So the demographics are great. It's a very diversified economy compared to some of the rest of the regional players, similar to what we discussed with the GCC. The issue is we're at a very difficult point in time because the currency has seen a significant devaluation, and the balance of payment situation is quite tight. And there is a very urgent need for reform. And it's because of what happened over the past decade, since the Arab Spring, where you went through different iterations and boom bust cycles, and you've had to devalue the currency significantly in 2016, and you've borrowed a lot of money from the IMF and from the neighbors and the GCC. You've sort of exhausted some of your options at the time when you have a sizable foreign debt that you have to start repaying in the near term. It's a critical moment in time that requires very serious action. We haven't seen a lot of evidence that points towards that yet. And that would require, the government to really take a step back and empower the private sector in a serious way and start privatizing some of the larger assets to be able to attract investments from the GCC, not donations from the GCC, because I don't think that's an option anymore. And it's sometimes politically and socially sensitive to do some of those things. But I think also you're at a point where there's a lot of pressure politically and socially because of the high inflation and the currency situation. So I'm really hoping that policymakers start very quickly embarking on this reform and privatization journey, so that we see evidence that there is enough awareness of the issue and the urgency, and then hopefully investments will follow. So I'm definitely rooting for the country. It's my country. It's where my family still is. So I hope things work out. But obviously, we are at a critical juncture, and it's not easy to have visibility at the moment for me. That said, we do have some exposure, but it could be much bigger if things turn around. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely something to watch. I saw some news reports of plans of selling stakes into more state-owned enterprises and privatization. So we'll see how that plays out.
Now you just need to see execution.
Yeah,
Which is the harder part.
So, one of the ways that we close out the podcast is get your opinion on other things as well. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, what's one long-term trend you see playing out over the next several years? It can be about Saudi Arabia, or it can be anything else that you happen to be thinking about.
I mean, obviously, a lot of people now are talking about artificial intelligence. ChatGPT is the thing that everyone, over coffee or drinks is talking about. To me, one of the areas from what I've been reading that I find fascinating is actually how you can apply that to the medical field. And maybe that's where my background as someone that hails from a family of doctors comes. But I think both in terms of being able to use artificial intelligence to improve the precision of diagnosis and treatment, and also as a way to really process data and accelerate clinical trials in a way that wasn't possible before. I think that's a potential that I'm very interested to see. I mean, obviously, along the way, because of the sensitivity of the field, there are some ethical questions around it. if we can get that right and really apply that in a way that helps people, helps the medical field and the biopharma field advance, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great use of that technology. All right. So as we end off, we do a segment called Trend or Fad. I think I told you about it. I haven't given you a heads up on what the topics are, so we'll see how this goes. I'll ask you about 3 to 5 different topics, and I can get your quick take, just trend or fad, or you can explain it if you'd like to. So the first one is easy. It's small cap stocks, trend or fad.
Trend. I mean, a lot of the companies that are more interesting and doing more interesting work that we see in emerging markets are actually small caps, smaller companies. So they are a very good way to play the longer term structural growth trends in EM, which I find quite exciting as someone who grew up in an emerging market. So I would bet on small caps long term. At least, I mean, definitely in the context of EM, but I think innovation and a lot of that happens also in smaller companies in the West as well.
Electric vehicles, trend or fad?
I mean, definitely trend, but it's just a question of whether we will have enough materials and resources and even like grid capacity to support the amount of, ambitious goals that some of the countries have laid out. So trend, but pace of penetration to me might be different than what people are targeting.
Buying US Treasury bills.
Fad. I'm an EM investor, so I'm, I wouldn't say I'm betting against the dollar because I'm also a dollar earner, but I'm hoping that this is a fad.
And then US citizens seeking golden passports, trend or fad?
That's a tricky one because I'm now in the process of trying to get my US citizenship because even though I understand there are, tax implications that are hefty, but it gives insurance in a different way for someone, who lives here and who comes from the Middle East. I also see others who have European passports that are really not trying to get US citizenship and moving back to Europe, even though they have the option. So I'm neutral on this one, let's say.
Sounds good. I just read an article about that. I thought it was fascinating. Well, Ola, thank you so much for your time today. It was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much for having me. And I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
And are you on social media at all? Or what's the best way for people to, read your blogs or find out more about you, connect with you?
My blogs are all available on our website at vanek.com. And I have my own tab, which is something recent and exciting. But also LinkedIn is another way that people can reach out or can, check out some of the stuff. Ola El-Shawarby is my full name. So those would be probably the best 2 options.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you very much. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Trends with Benefits.